And for those who really want to use this transformatory tool, it's helping to, in Sanskrit, there's a word called anartha, which means removing, which means unwanted things in the heart. Those things that block us, that prevent us from being kind, compassionate, truly good souls in this world who can serve one another. And what the Enneagram does is, I think it pinpoints what are those particular places that we can really work on, and how we can start to remove those unwanted things in the heart, and how we can really show up as our true self.
Everyone, welcome back to the Soul Worker podcast, and I have Vrin with me. How do you say your last name, Vrin?
Rao.
Rao? Okay, nice to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, would you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. So I am a mindfulness coach, and I say that because it's the crux of really being able to be present and to understand our unconscious reactions. And that's what I really do. I work with women primarily to help them understand what are the unconscious reactions that drive their life, or in other words, why are we doing things that are hurting us? And I do this by using the Enneagram and various practices of meditation.
Awesome. I love that. I love that you're touching the subconscious and the deeper stuff here, and that, you're working with women to help them. But I love how you use the Enneagram in the mix of that, because, and just for a little bit of context before we start, asking, introducing people to what is the Enneagram and how do they know what that is, how do they find out. I just wanted to share a little bit of context myself of how I came to discover Enneagram. And so essentially, 5-6 years ago, I was like on this like self-discovery kind of journey where I was like, I don't really know myself. And I felt really confused because I would hear a lot of people say, oh, they're introverted, but I felt like I was a different type of introvert. And so that was really confusing for me. So I just started kind of like Googling like personality types. And then I think that's how like I found the Enneagram test. And then I did it, and then I got my type, and I started reading all about it. And I was kind of like a bit obsessed with like just reading as much as I could. And then it was really weird because I was like, wow, this is so, me. And I felt validated, and I had this connection. But there was also things where I was like, am I? Like, I kind of questioned. And so once I kind of went through that phase of like learning a lot of stuff, and then I started to kind of integrate more into it, where I was catching myself, I kind of think about like as a parent when they have kids, and then they're constantly seeing their kids like doing new things, and you're like, wow, like that's so interesting. You're like learning about your child. And so that's how I kind of saw myself as like, I am that way, or I am doing that. And then I remember joining, I don't know if this is something that you can also add to it, but I remember joining like Facebook groups where it was all about like the Enneagrams. And that kind of got confusing for me because I started to see like there was different, like, I was like, well, we are really different too. And then I remember one person brought up this point that like, well, there's like an evolved, Enneagram type. And then there's, some that are still kind of working their way up. And I'm like, oh, okay, So it was really interesting to kind of see that dynamic as well. So with that being said, first off, I want to see if you can introduce us to what is Enneagram in the first place.
Sure. So the Enneagram is commonly known as a personality framework. Sometimes people use the word test, but for what I've found it to be, is it's something much more deeper than a test. It is really looking at the motivation behind why we do anything. So it's not based on behavior, it's based on motivation. And within motivation, you can think of motivation as being comprised almost of two parts. One is our needs, and the other is our fears. And so when we are able to really access and start to really see how our motivations are showing up in every single facet of our life, we really start to become more aware. And I'm sure this is something that you've experienced yourself, you come across a lot. Self-awareness is a big word out there. And there
Mm-hmm.
are lots of people who are saying, oh, yes, I can help you become self-aware. There's numerous self-awareness books. But to have a very tangible starting point as to where that self-awareness can begin for each individual is such a gift. And I feel like that is really the power of the Enneagram. It gives you very, very tangible starting points.
Mm-hmm. And we know we mentioned the testing part. So how exactly would a person, if like have never heard of the Enneagram, how exactly would they figure out what their type is?
Yeah. So the Enneagram, just like maybe like a brief little um, walk around it, is made up of 9 points, commonly known as types. And each of these 9 points have different motivations that are associated with them, different energies. You can even look at them as different lenses by which we see the world through. And we have all of the 9 energies, but there's one that is most pronounced, and that is commonly known as your primary type. And then there's a secondary one that tends to support it. And so the best way that I have found personally to really figure out your type is in a couple of ways. One is if you are a person who really is willing to dedicate the time and go into the nitty gritty, there's nothing like reading and reading and reading about the different types, the motivations, the fears, the needs. And so that would be the starting point for most people. I would say even just getting a chance to look at some of the different descriptions broadly. The second best way, or I would say equally as good, is to attend a workshop, because there you get an idea of how the energies come to life. Because so much of the identification of your type is actually revealed through your body language, which is
Mm,
something that many people don't really know about, right?
yeah.
So it's not just the characteristics you identify with, it's how you actually come off to other people. And then
Wow.
the other piece is doing a one-on-one consultation with somebody who has really worked with the Enneagram and who can ask a lot of deep questions to really get to the motivation. Typically, for those who are interested, I don't recommend the tests. And the reason for that is it can be a nice starting point if you're one of those people who can just kind of hold it loosely. But often when we do a kind of personality type test, there's a way in which we can have a little bit of a bias once we've been identified with a certain number or a certain type or a certain, what if it's Myers-Briggs, I have IFN, however the typings may be. So
Mm-hmm.
because of that, I typically don't encourage tests, mainly because they're multiple choice. And the thing with the Enneagram that's so nuanced is that, at least in the tests that I have seen out there, I could probably pick all of the answers. It just depends on when and what situation that I'm in.
Mm, yeah. And would you say that this is something that comes from the environment that you were raised in? Is that how it is determined, or is it something like you're born with, or how does that work?
Such a great question. So, um, the thought leaders within the Enneagram field have more and more come to agree that it's a combination of both nurture and nature. So, there are certain things that you're just inherently coming into this life with. And that's why, if someone is very familiar with the Enneagram and um, can kind of like look to see certain features and highlights, even by the age of 3 to 5 years old, a child, you can kind of like figure out what their type might be. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, I would never suggest that any parent ever tell their child or try to type their child. But what it can do as a parent is it can really help to inform you what are the motivations that are driving this little human being, and how I
Mm-hmm.
can support them, and how I can also talk to them in language by which they can really hear and understand me, and encourage them.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting and great because I would have even not have thought that you could think or include, a child as already sort of understanding what their type is. Now it brings me to my next question, I guess, is does it ever change? Is there room for growth or for things to shift or, how does that work?
Yes. So with the Enneagram, one of the things that makes it such a dynamic framework is that there are the different types. And within the different types, even if within one type, there are different levels of consciousness. And so because there are different levels of consciousness, kind of what you were saying at the beginning, you can kind of like devolve or evolve in your type. You look very different at different stages of your consciousness. So your type never changes, but you may start to resemble another type in health when you become really healthy, when you become very conscious, and you can start to resemble and take on traits of another type when you're extremely stressed. And these can actually be really good benchmarks for an individual to see, what level of consciousness am I operating in right now? Am I more aware, and that's why I'm starting to kind of take on these characteristics, or am I actually really stressed and I'm starting to find that I'm taking on these traits that aren't that aren't those that I really associate myself with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess is there a way for people to kind of like work with, the different enneagrams as well? Like what would be useful tools, I guess, to help with the different types?
Different tools. Well, I think the biggest tool that we can really offer to work with the different types is to get a good sense of all of the nine energies. So spending time with that. And essentially once one, and this takes a long time, and I personally, I think it would take a lifetime's worth of work, to be honest. But once you get to a stage where you are actually very, very aware, you actually start to have access to all nine energies. So you can think of your energy as the default,
Mm.
right? That's the default setting. And this is kind of where I operate. This is my home base. This is where I feel comfortable. But when I start to become much more conscious, I start to recognize that, say, even if I am um, a little bit more reserved, understated for particular motivations, particular needs and fears that run me, at a time when I'm much more conscious and have the ability to see what is needed, I could actually take on a very different energy, perhaps a very assertive energy that is not something that I would typically associate myself with. But I
Hmm.
have the access to do that because my lens is just so much bigger and broader.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds great. I love this. So here's another question too, is kind of diving a little bit deeper into it. So with the nine types, do they kind of range between, is there like threes and threes where does it kind of
Mm,
go from like maybe intuitive or more, related to certain different, I guess, elements?
yeah, the Enneagram has various different groupings, and it's such a great question. I really appreciate it. So you can break up the nine types into different triads or different groupings of three. And so one of those groupings is through categorizing them based on the body. So the gut center.
Okay.
So the 8, 9, and the 1, for example, are part of the gut center. So there's this instinctive drive that's what they're kind of pulled by in their
Mm-hmm.
life and in the way in which they see the world. That's their reaction. That's how they react to the world. Then there are the heart center types, the 2, 3, and the 4.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean other types don't have that body energy or that other types don't have that heart energy. But when I'm talking about the ones that are within this particular grouping or within this center, I mean, this is what really pulls them. So they are more influenced by the feelings and by um, what's happening and with my emotions and how do I make sense of it. And then finally, there are the head centered types. And this is more of the cerebral thinkers. Like I analyze, I want to do like pro and con lists and such. And those are the 5, 6, and the 7s. So you can break up the Enneagram types within the centers. And these are also known as the centers of intelligence. So for some, they have more access to the body intelligence, some have more access to the heart intelligence, and some have more access to that analytical head intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that explanation. Actually, I've never heard. So you're really bringing a lot of different elements that I haven't necessarily, obviously run into. So I really appreciate this. Now, would you say that um they're different, like what's the importance of somebody maybe like understanding theirs, and maybe would it be helpful to understand like other people, so like maybe like within your family system or your
Mm.
partner, your friends, how would you say that it's kind of like an important role for someone to kind of know?
Personally, I would say absolutely. And I would say it starts first with ourselves, as most inner work, most transformatory work does, to
Hmm.
really figure out how I operate. So I
Hmm.
think of the Enneagram as someone essentially offering you a blueprint, and they're giving you language that you didn't even know existed to
Hmm.
explain the inner workings of how you feel, think, and react to the world. And so by being able to understand your type. And understanding your type, I'll also say this, I think sometimes this isn't such a popular approach to the Enneagram, but one of the Enneagram teachers that I really respect and admire, Russ Hudson, speaks about this himself. He says for over, I think, 2 years, he had mistyped himself. That even being able to figure out your type can
Hmm.
take time for some people. For some, it's just instantaneous. It's so quick. It's just like you read something or you hear something and you just feel an instant pull, an instant unease. That's
Hmm.
typically how people identify their type. They feel queasy or they feel a little bit like, oh, no, nobody else knows this. How can somebody be describing this? Or how can
Yeah.
this book be saying this? Right.
Yeah.
So, having the patience, I would say, or the openness to allowing it to take the time it takes to really figure out your type, I think is so important because there's a lot of mistyping that goes on these days. And I think, like with anything, as the popularity of the Enneagram has just risen exponentially, there is just more and more information there. But with popularity tends to be a desire to figure things out quickly, right?
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
the Enneagram has now become one of these things like, oh, what's your astrological sign? Oh, what's your Enneagram number? But to me personally, it's actually quite a private thing if you talk about your Enneagram type because it reveals a lot. And that information is something that's very precious. And for those who really want to use this transformatory tool, it's helping to in Sanskrit, there's a word called anartha, which means unwanted things in the heart. Those things
Yeah.
that block us, that prevent us from being kind, compassionate, truly good souls in this world who can serve one another. And what the Enneagram does is, I think it pinpoints what are those particular places that we can really work on and how we can start to remove those unwanted things in the heart and how we can really show up as our true selves.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And now I'm curious also to how does your work with uncovering like the deeper stuff into the Enneagram, so how does that kind of play a role together? How are you able to determine based on the different types of like what is it that is maybe creating blockages or those sorts of things.
Sure. So maybe I can give an example. So, for example, the point nine or the type nine, the basic need for the type nine is to experience harmony, unity, flow. And those are
Mhm.
things we all would love to experience in our life. But for the nines, like, this is it, you know?
Mhm.
And the basic fear or the deepest fear is that I lose my inner peace. I lose my inner world of peace, in fact. And so when working with somebody and as we figure out their Enneagram type, if they don't know it, or if they do know it, one of the emotional reactions or one of those blockages that can come about is the tendency to shut down when I feel overwhelmed. And this is where the Enneagram is very powerful because it's so specific. There's a way in which, and if you talk to any nine who has done any work, they'll say, yep, shut down. That's where I go to. When I feel overwhelmed, I just shut down. And there are particular ways in which they may shut down. And so this is how I really bring in the Enneagram into doing this work of how can we start to um, work with this reflexive response that when something feels overwhelming, I shut down. And learning how to pause and being able to notice even within the body. So the nines being a body centered type here, like let's use that intelligence of the body to experience what does overwhelm feel like? What does shutting down feel like? Being able to notice that within the body, being able to catch it when it's happening, and then being able to figure out and co-create what are other ways in which I can respond starts to alleviate those blockages. Otherwise, these unconscious reactions just tend to run our lives.
Wow, that's so interesting. Now, would you mind also sharing maybe like because now I'm also curious to see like what would be the other types, and you know how you grouped them in different um points. So if we did the one, what is it, the 8, 9, and 1. So if you could kind of give an example of like the other groups as
Okay,
well.
sure. Right. So we did one from the body center. So we'll do one heart and we'll do
Yeah.
one head. Sure, absolutely. So with the heart center type, so the type three, one of the unconscious emotional reactions for the threes is to feel frustrated or feeling a sense of frustration because things aren't moving fast enough.
Hmm.
Now, for the threes, the basic need is to feel valuable. I want to feel my worth. Now, I think this is universal, but for the threes, this just really runs the show. I just want to feel my worth. And my fear is to feel worthless. And so, what can happen for the threes is that they can, all types are prone to this, but the threes especially, they can be prone to becoming workaholics because I start to associate my value with my output.
Mm-hmm.
And because I'm associating that, now I'm starting to feel like things need to go faster. Efficiency is the name of the game, right? The more that gets done, the more valuable I'll feel. And so if I'm working with others, now my irritation and frustration starts to come onto them if they're not working as fast as I am, right? And so being able to see that, being able to start to uncouple now that equation of my worth is equal to my output is just so important. And to recognize that I'm losing my capacity to even feel a sense of value or satisfaction of what I've even done because I'm constantly chasing the next thing. So
Mm-hmm.
that's how it is for the threes. So, how can I start to uncouple that? How can I start to actually slow down? And when I slow down, I can actually find and feel my heart again.
Yeah. Wow.
So, that's for the three.
Mm-hmm.
That's for the heart. And then one for the head center types. So I'm picking essentially the centers of the centers. So we did the 9, we did the 3, we'll do the 6. And so you can say, I say the centers of the centers because you have the 8, then the 9, which is the center, and then the 1. And then we have the 2, the 3, which is the center, and then the 4. And we have the 5, the 6, which is the center of the head center types, and then the 7. So in case anybody is curious about that phrasing. But for the 6s, their basic fear is essentially losing the ground beneath my feet, that lack of stability. And my desire is to feel a sense of trust, right? A sense of really feeling confident that what I am putting my faith in is truly the right thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so with the 6s, one of the emotional reactions that can come up is a need for constant assurance. And so this can come up, for example, in a workplace setting where they may ask a peer and they may say, well, this is what such and such told us to do, right? And then the peer says yes, and then they go back and they're working on it, and then they suddenly feel a sense of anxiety and they feel like, well, I'm not sure I actually heard that right. Let me double check. Let me go ask somebody else. And so I'm going around and I'm asking different people because I don't necessarily have that trust in myself that I even heard something right. And so now I'm going around looking for assurance. And that becomes a dependency, that becomes a reaction that I have to pretty much anything that I may face in my life, depending, I guess, on how healthy and aware I am in my type. And so being able to notice that pattern. And when I work with 6s, this is something that comes up often. And the question becomes, well, but what if I'm wrong? And then the question becomes, well, you've asked 2 people. How many people do you need to ask in order to trust this is correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to question our own doubts can be so important. And again, there's this constant underlying coming back to foundation of pausing, pausing, pausing. And it's when we pause that we can actually start to see our patterns of reactivity.
Yeah. And so then when you're working with your clients, I guess what is kind of like the overall structure that you sort of lead these typically women? How do you typically lead throughout your coaching sessions and such?
Well, normally we figure out what is it that is, well, often people come to me because they're trying to figure out, why am I doing this thing that isn't serving me? Like, I'm acting in this way, I'm reacting in this way. Some people are coming with a very specific knowledge, right? They're saying, I'm getting angry with this person in my life, or I feel like I have no voice when I am in a work environment, whatever that might be. And for others, they're kind of curious. They're not quite sure because they realize there are emotional reactions happening to them, but they're not even aware what it is. Right. And so I work with both groups of individuals, teams, women. And typically where we start is, if they don't know their Enneagram type, we start there because that starting point gives at least some ideas as to where we can start to look. And we start to look at very minute, small interactions in their day-to-day life to kind of see how these motivations, these needs are showing up. And this becomes such a wealth of information. And over, I have heard that individuals coming back or groups coming back and saying, I never noticed this happening until I just brought some awareness to this. And from
Mm-hmm.
there, we start to unpack it, because the first step is to bring awareness and to start noticing that this is happening constantly is a shock for most of us, right? There's a particular motivation that's coming out over and over and over again.
Yeah. Now, one other question too that sort of just came up for me is, do you tend to notice, is there such thing as like males, a difference between males and females having certain leaning towards certain Enneagram types at all?
As far as whatever research has been done on that, there doesn't seem to be any kind of like bias or leaning towards that. There
Okay.
are certain types that tend to be um, a little bit more like stereotypically thought of as male, stereotypically thought as female, but that really doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it just means sometimes that we need to actually we need to let go of those kinds of biases, and that if there are more nurturing traits that are showing up in a man, that should be celebrated. And if there are more of those um, you know what? I don't even know what to call it. I don't want to use the word assertive. I feel like that's wrong. Like a woman should be assertive. That shouldn't be considered male
Masculine.
or
Yeah.
female, right? You know, but if
Yeah.
those kinds, whatever those could be, those kinds of more masculine traits, then so be it.
Yeah. Now, okay, so I want to do something. Hopefully you're okay with it. And I want to put myself on the spot a little bit and
Sure.
just see. So I've done a couple of the tests, like I mentioned, and I've actually done them several times just because I'm like, what if I changed, you know?
Mhm.
Um, and I'm always kind of, I have a little bit of skepticism when it comes to just anything really. I like to prove, you know, and maybe this is related to my type, I don't know. Um, so just for, you know, for viewers to kind of just get a feel of it too. So I'm gonna put myself on the spot. So I've discovered that I'm a type 5 with a 4 wing,
Mhm.
the 4. So I guess could you maybe share a little bit on what that kind of looks like?
Sure. So typically with the type fives, and of course, so much, I'm going to caveat this, and I always caveat this with it depends on the level of consciousness, it depends on the level of health, right? But
Mm-hmm.
typically, type fives, the five with the four is the most introverted of all the types. It's the most introverted because the fives have a very pulled back energy and the fours have a very pulled back energy. And so that makes it a double introverted type. Now, there are scales of introversion and extroversion on the Enneagram, and
Okay.
this can deal somewhat with the type, but there's another layer that comes in as well. I won't go into that now, but known as the instincts, and that can have a particular flavor to add to whether there's more extroversion or introversion. But
Okay.
everybody has extroversion, introversion. I don't really find it has it plays so much, but
Mm-hmm.
particularly with the type 4 and the type 5, it does because it is the most introverted of all the types. Now, the type 5, the basic need and the basic fear for the type 5 is the fear is ignorance,
Mm-hmm.
that I actually don't. And if you look at it on a more personal level, there's almost a sense of I don't have the information I need to figure out this world. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
constantly looking for that information. I'm just very information centric. And my desire is for clarity, is for great illumination, right? It's not actually, um, and fives will speak about this. They'll say, it's not that I can think of a lot of things or that I can memorize a lot of facts. What I'm looking for are those like these like bursts of genius that just kind of like come up. They just
Mm-hmm.
come up on their own. And the way in which I achieve that is through a lot of silence. Solitude is what I crave. And that
Mm-hmm.
is why they tend to be the most introverted of the types, because they feel like people actually add to so much of the chatter. And then I can't actually reach that clarity that I'm so desperately looking for.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty spot on. Um, Now you do say that, well, let's go back and say like, okay, so what would be more of an evolved, or more self-aware aspect of a five then? How would that look like?
So the fives also tend to avoid contact with other people. So there's a way in which they can become extremely reclusive. And so, like, I can start to go down rabbit holes. Expertise is something that I am really after. And it's not that I'm looking for um, credit really for the expertise that I have. It's that
Mm-hmm.
I just really want to be expert in something. And there tends to be, um, and it's not always the case, but there does tend to be a tendency towards, things that are just very different. Like things off the beaten path. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm an expert in, African beetles, or I'm an expert in, Middle Eastern architecture, right? It's the expertise isn't necessarily like something that will make me money, right? Like for the threes, for example, there's a way in which I want to be an expert, but I want to be an expert because it helps me to figure out and like it helps me to recognize and experience my own worth. And when other people recognize my expertise, that makes me feel even more valuable. For the
Mm-hmm.
fives, it's not so much that. It's I want to be an expert because this is my way of navigating the world. That's
Mm-hmm.
very different,
Yeah.
right? Navigation of the world versus experiencing my worth,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so when fives become much more aware, then the contact with others that they may dismiss or avoid, even, they start to recognize that's what actually helps them get in touch with their heart. And so there's more of I would say there's a little bit more focus towards actually establishing that type of contact with other people.
Mm-hmm. And now you mentioned there was a part where you mentioned that we all have all nine types
That's right.
or have access to that. So I'm curious as to like how that would look and how we can tap into those. Is it depending upon something that like a time in our lives, or is it look like if we're like at our career and like we all, tend to jump on one, and at home do we, how does that look like?
Sure. So, a couple of different ways. So, one way is that we have access to at least two of the types a bit more readily, and that is through stress and that is through growth. So, we have access to those energies pretty immediately. And
Mm-hmm.
so, especially in stress, you may notice that you start to take on um, the shadow parts of another type, essentially. And so you start to access that energy. And similarly, in growth, you start to access the higher qualities of another type. So that's one way in which you can do that. Going back to your previous question about nature and nurture, one of the ways in which people mistype is because cultures actually have a predominant like
Yeah.
Enneagram type to them. Countries
Mm-hmm.
have a particular Enneagram type to them. And so
Mm-hmm.
because of that, depending on um, how much that's pervasive in the atmosphere, people within that culture or tribe or group may almost take on those qualities, even if that doesn't come naturally to them. And when
Okay.
that happens, that's a way in which you start to take on the another like different energies of the various nine types.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah, it happens actually more frequently than people think.
So then does that mean that it would also happen like if you were in a household with siblings and, and your parents and that being an influence there too?
It can absolutely. So siblings don't necessarily have, at least there doesn't seem to be any type of correlation to siblings having similar Enneagram types or families having different Enneagram types, but there may be a certain ethos. So, for example, and in no way do I mean to stereotype, but there can be a lot of three energy in Asian households, for example. You know, the desire to be the best that you can be, to really succeed, to work really hard, to do all of those things. And that energy is amazing and commendable. But if a child or another family member within that family doesn't necessarily have that particular nature, it might be hard for them, right? Because although they may appreciate that energy, it may not come naturally to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so having the sensitivity to kind of read the room is really important, because all the 9 types have incredible gifts, and all the 9 types have all kinds of shadows. There is no type that is better or worse on the Enneagram. We all have our stuff.
Yeah, because when even when I read, like when I heard and have discovered mine, which I typically do think I relate to it pretty well. Um, I'm just like, I don't know. It just kind of, yeah. I'm just like, I don't know if I like the fact that I'm a 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's very common, especially if we can, when we start to tap into the needs and the fears and we see the shadow parts to ourselves, that can make us feel really kind of like icky or queasy. But in those times, it's also important to remember that there are like very specific gifts that are associated with these types as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I my another one of my last questions as we're kind of getting here to a close is first of all, I'd like to know a little bit about what kind of got you into, if you don't mind sharing, into like the work that you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah. So I kind of say, like, in a previous life, because it does feel like a previous life now, I actually have my bachelor's and my master's in biochem. And between my biochem degree and my master's degree, I went to Belgium, of all places, and lived in an ashram there for 4 months. And during that time, really delved into this culture I had grown up with, known as Bhakti Yoga, or
Mm-hmm.
the yoga of love. And really kind of chose for the first time in my life, like, yes, this is, these are the practices that I really want to cultivate. And ended up deferring my master's for a year, stayed there, and then moved to do my master's, and really disliked it. And around that time realized I want to work with people, but had no idea what that would look like. For about 5, 6 years afterwards, worked as a teacher in a college teaching biology. Then I worked for the Canadian government. I'm Canadian by birth, and
Oh, okay.
regulated natural health products. Then I worked for an industry association, and then met my husband through a friend, and he lives in New York. And felt at that time, okay, I kind of got my return on investment. I wanted to do some work in the field I had studied in, and felt like I have no idea what I want to do. And coaching, no clue what a coach was. For me, a coach was like a sports coach, right? Like basketball
Yeah,
coach,
yeah.
like I had a badminton coach. That was what a coach was for me. And it was on my husband's suggestion. And he suggested, why don't you take a coaching certification? I think it would be helpful just to build self-awareness, more tools as you kind of embark on what you want to do next. And went into it 25 minutes into my first session with this group, and was like, oh no, this is what I want to do. And I say, oh no, because my husband was just starting up his own business as a coach.
Okay.
And it was actually through him and one of his best friends who had been studying the Enneagram for, at the time I had met them, like for over 11 years, that I actually learned about the Enneagram. And for
Wow.
me, it was like duck to water. I had already been doing research on nature. Like, I really felt like people had a particular inherent nature. And to recognize and understand that more deeply could be incredibly valuable. And so, with coaching and the Enneagram, and then my background in meditation, I just felt like this like could be a really holistic kind of approach to being able to do this inner work, which actually has so much impact in the way we show up with other people and the way we show up as ourselves.
Hmm. Wow, that's amazing. I love that story. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. And I guess one last question would be misconceptions, or is there anything that like you feel like that you'd like to kind of maybe share as far as misconceptions? Because I can't really pinpoint at this point, but I feel like the conversation that I've had with you today, like, and we were talking about this just, earlier, I do feel like there has been a lot of things that I have picked up that I'm like, there was, not necessarily even incorrect, but there was just like a sense of not even the full information, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, I'd like to hear some of your thoughts if you don't mind sharing on maybe perhaps like, is there some misconceptions that you've heard that you'd like to maybe clear up, or I don't know, something along the lines?
Sure. There's so many misconceptions. I'm trying to think of like the ones that come up most readily. And um, one question, perhaps a misconception that can arise is: are there types that are best for compatibility?
Oh, good one.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a very common one. Are there two types that are most compatible? And the answer over and over is two healthy types. That those are the most compatible types. That's it. Has nothing to do with your Enneagram type. It has
Okay.
everything to do with your level of awareness and consciousness. Because if you can respect, admire, and be able to hold somebody else's suffering, that means you'll be compatible. But
Mm-hmm.
there may be a little bit more understanding if you're similar types, but that can also be a recipe for disaster,
Right.
right? So that's one that comes to mind immediately. The
Yeah.
other piece around, um, yeah, the Enneagram is just, it's your type is just, don't get too caught up in it, because it can change. And I think that the don't get too caught up in it has a place, because it's easy for us to get very obsessed with things. I think as a society, like we just
Mm-hmm.
have a tendency to do that. It's important to hold it loosely, but I think it also undermines the depth of the Enneagram, because there's a lot of substance here. And if you're
Mm-hmm.
willing to actually look at your stuff, then you're going to get a lot out of it. I think what happens with the Enneagram is it becomes this kind of fun thing to talk about. And with the explosion of like accounts on Instagram and memes and all of these things that can be, absolutely, they can be funny, and God knows we need humor in this world. But it also has a way in which it actually goes against the very thing that the Enneagram is about. It addresses behavior. It doesn't speak to motivation, right? And
Yeah.
so you get memes and caricatures of different types, which are based on, granted, behaviors that are often seen, but that's not what the Enneagram's about. It's about the motivation. And I feel like it loses its gravity, because when you think about motivation, when you think about needs and fears, when you think about somebody's fears, there it for most of us, I think it would bring forth compassion, right? A
Yeah.
fear, and the fear of unmet needs, even, is a type of suffering for individuals. And so that's really what the Enneagram, I think, is there for. It's to help in its own way alleviate suffering. It may not be
Mhm.
able to do that on a grand scale, but it's definitely helpful. And so I think the gravity of the Enneagram is something that is often, there's a lot of misconception around it. It just becomes like a fun, cool thing, which it can be, but there's so much more to it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that you are bringing that with your coaching and everything like that, that you're tying all these things together, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing, with helping out and educating everyone. And um is there any I mean, I'm gonna have like your contact information in the notes, but is there anything that you're potentially working on upcoming, or anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, actually going to be, I always have one-on-one sessions. Typically, they're limited, but there are a couple of spots open now in case anybody is interested. I also do something called an Enneagram consultation. And so, if anybody is curious to figure out their type, this is a specialized coaching session where we will sit down and together come up with a good hypothesis on what your type is. And the reason why I say we're not going to figure out your type, I say a hypothesis, is because I think that is the most we can do. And
Mhm.
then it's up to each individual to test it out, test it out, test it out. Often I've found that it's pretty accurate, but it gives the space and it brings forth an element of bringing in some curiosity to see in case if it might be another type. And
Mhm.
so that's something I offer. And then I'm just going to be coming out with a 3-part series on meditations and these different centers of intelligence. So that might be something that might be interesting.
Oh yeah, that'll be great too.
Yeah.
All right, Rin. Thank you so much for joining me and for, sharing everything with me today. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome. And thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, of course. All right. I will speak to everyone soon.